The Muddy Water. Chapter 1. The Logging Road. The call came in at 7:40 in the morning, routed through the county dispatcher before it reached Harrow Cove Station, which told Nora before she even picked up the phone that whatever had happened was not strictly local. A hunter named Gerald Foss had walked out of the woods behind the old Prentice Mill and found a truck parked on the logging road 2 miles past the town line. He had described it to the dispatcher in the careful, unhurried way that men who spend long hours alone in the woods tend to describe things. A dark green pickup, windows fogged from the inside, a hose running from the exhaust pipe into the passenger window, engine off, keys in the ignition. He had not touched anything. He had walked back to the gravel track and called from his own vehicle. Cole was already in his coat when Nora arrived at the station, keys in hand. Expression settled into the particular blankness he wore when something was going to take the whole day. "State police are leading," he said. "Scene is outside the town line, so it goes to them. But Beaumont called ahead. They want local support on family notifications and background on Langley." "Peter Langley?" Nora pulled her jacket from the hook by the door. "The construction owner. You know him?" "Not well. He bid on the foundation work for the new harbor master building 2 years ago. My grandfather said he was fair, did decent work, did not cut corners on the drainage." Cole considered this for a moment in the way he considered most things Nora said, with a slight pause that suggested he was filing it rather than dismissing it. "Get your gear. We follow Beaumont's cruiser out." The access road to the logging track branched off Route 17 near the old mill lot, marked by nothing more than a gap in the tree line and 2 shallow ruts that had been deepening and softening for the past 3 weeks as the freeze-thaw cycles worked at the ground. Cole drove slowly. The mud gripped the tires and released them with a reluctant sucking sound, and the spruce on either side stood close and dark, their lower branches stripped bare by years of snow load. Nothing grew along the road's edge yet. The ground was the color of old burlap. Matted dead grass pressed flat under the weight of a winter that had not quite finished leaving. The truck was visible from 50 yards out, a dark green pickup, late model, parked at a slight angle where the road widened against a section of collapsed stone wall. The state police had arrived first and set up a perimeter with cones and tape. 2 troopers stood near the vehicle. The medical examiner's van was parked 20 feet back, and a third figure in a gray jacket crouched near the rear of the truck, examining the exhaust pipe. Cole pulled up behind the van and they got out. The hose was the first thing Nora looked at. It ran from the exhaust pipe along the passenger side of the truck, up through the rear corner of the passenger window, and disappeared inside. The duct tape securing it to the window frame had been applied in careful, overlapping layers, gray against the dark metal of the door. Whoever had wrapped it had been thorough. The tape ran outward from the hose in both directions, pressing the gap closed against the frame, covering the full width of the opening where the hose entered. From the outside, it looked deliberate, methodical, the work of someone who wanted to be certain. Nora stood at the perimeter tape and looked at the angle of the wrap. For a person sitting in the driver's seat to have applied it that way, they would have needed to reach across the full width of the cab and press the tape against the exterior edge of the glass, working blind from the inside out. It was possible. It was also the kind of awkward that did not match a man in the grip of despair who would not be thinking about thoroughness or method. She did not say any of this. She looked at the tape and she filed it. Trooper Beaumont came over to meet them, a large man with a careful manner that Nora associated with investigators who had seen enough scenes to stop being surprised by them. He shook Cole's hand and nodded at Nora. "Medical examiner is preliminary only at this stage," he said, addressing Cole. "Death consistent with carbon monoxide. Scene presentation fits. We have a note. handwritten, found in the jacket pocket. He paused. She has questions about the tape application. The wrap direction does not sit right with her. Nothing in the report yet, but she flagged it verbally. What kind of questions? Nora asked. Beaumont looked at her. Direction of the overlap. Tension on the outer edge. Her read is that it was applied from outside the vehicle rather than inside. She wants to document it fully before she puts anything in writing. Cole said nothing. Nora nodded. Beaumont continued. The note was addressed to Peter Langley's wife. It apologized. It described a man who had reached the end of what he could carry. The language, Beaumont said, was fairly literary for a construction foreman. The phrasing was complete and structured, the sentences long and considered, not the kind of writing that came from a person at the bottom of something. Cole looked at Nora when Beaumont said this. Nora was still looking at the tape. They stayed while the medical examiner completed her initial work on the scene. The morning was cold and clear, the frost not yet gone from the shadowed places along the road, and the mud in the tire tracks had a gray sheen where the surface had frozen overnight and not yet softened. The woodpeckers were working in the spruce somewhere to the north, the sound carrying in the still air with a precision that felt almost architectural. A second set of tire tracks ran parallel to the truck's tracks for most of the approach, then veered to the right and stopped where the road widened near the stone wall, as if a second vehicle had parked alongside and then left. The mud had preserved the impressions well. Beaumont had already photographed them. He told Cole the tread pattern was from a sedan, not a truck. Narrow track width, all-season tires. He said the state crime lab would run a comparison against common models. Nora looked at the impressions. The sedan had parked close. Whoever had been in it had not needed to walk far. On the drive back to town, Cole watched the road and spoke without looking at her. Langley had been losing bids for the past year. Cole Construction took 2 major contracts that should have gone to him. By most accounts, financial pressure was real. His wife reported he'd been drinking more than usual. And before that, he was steady. 15 years in business. No major complaints. A few disputes over payment schedules, but nothing that went to court. Cole paused. He knew people, had a reputation for knowing things about people, and being careful with what he knew. Nora watched the spruce thin and give way to the first houses at the edge of town, their yards soft and brown, the gravel driveways rutted and gray. Who benefits from the death? Wife inherits the business and a life insurance policy, combined somewhere around $800,000. That is a significant number. State police will work that angle. We handle local background, interviews with people who knew him well. Cole glanced at her briefly. I want you to talk to the wife this afternoon. Not as the lead investigator, just as local. Someone who knew Harrow Cove the way she knows it. Nora agreed. They were coming into town now, passing the harbor road. The water flat and gray, and still carrying a chill that would not leave until May. A fishing boat was motoring out toward the mouth of the cove, the first of the season to go out this early, and its wake spread behind it in a slow white line across the surface. On the main road, near the entrance to the Langley construction yard, a gray sedan sat along the curb with its engine off. Nora noted the license plate the way she noted most things that did not quite fit without deciding to. The numbers settling into the back of her mind the way small details did when she was not paying particular attention to anything at all. She did not think about it again until later, but she did not forget it either. Chapter 2. The Widow. Nora pulled into the Langley driveway at 2:15, the sun already starting its low arc toward the tree line behind the house. The gravel was soft, and she could feel the cruiser sink slightly with each turn of the wheels, the weight of the vehicle pressing into ground that had not fully hardened since the thaw began. She cut the engine and sat for a moment. The house was a colonial, White clapboard with black shutters, the kind of place that looked proper in July and a little forlorn in March. The lawn was the color of old paper, flattened by snow and not yet standing up again. A single car sat in the driveway, a Subaru wagon with mud caked up to the door handles. No movement at the windows. The only sound was a pair of crows working something over in the field behind the property line, their calls sharp and declarative. Sarah Langley opened the door before Nora knocked, as if she had been standing in the front hall waiting. She was 45, Nora guessed, with the kind of face that people called handsome rather than pretty, strong bones, and a mouth that looked like it knew how to keep quiet. Her eyes were red at the rims, but not swollen. She had been crying earlier, maybe that morning, but she had stopped. She invited Nora into the kitchen without asking why she was there. That told Nora something the state police had already come and gone, and Sarah had learned the rhythm of these visits. A local officer meant local questions. She was ready for them. The kitchen was warm, the kind of warm that came from an old cast iron radiator tucked under the window, ticking softly as the heat expanded the pipes. A coffee mug sat on the counter, half full, a faint skin forming on the surface. The dishes in the drying rack looked like they had been there since the night before. Everything about the room said someone had stopped in the middle of things and had not found the energy to start again. Nora sat where Sarah pointed, at the kitchen table near the window, and accepted a cup of coffee she did not particularly want because refusing felt like a small cruelty. Sarah sat across from her, both hands wrapped around her own mug, and waited. Nora asked about Peter first, not about the note or the truck or the hose, just about Peter, what kind of man he was, what he did when he came home at the end of a day, whether he read the paper at the table or in his chair. Sarah answered in a voice that was flat but not cold. She said Peter was a quiet man, not a talker. He kept things to himself. He read the paper at the table, but he did not talk about what he read. He watched the news with the sound down. He was not unhappy, she said. He was just not the kind of man who expressed much of anything, either way. Nora let the silence sit. Sarah filled it. He was not good with words, she said. He never wrote anything longer than a shopping list. His handwriting was terrible. He knew it. He used to joke that the only reason he got through high school was because the teachers could not read his answers well enough to mark them wrong. Nora smiled at that. It was the right response. But she was listening to something else. When the state police showed me the note this morning, I knew it was his handwriting. The letters slant the way he slanted them. The capital P has that little hook he always made. Sarah paused. Her fingers tightened on the mug. But the words were not his. Peter never said things like, "Cannot bear the weight of my failures." He would have said, "I messed up," or "I could not fix it." He did not talk about darkness or weight or any of that. He was not that kind of man. Nora said nothing. She let the observation sit in the air between them. Sarah looked at her. "Does that matter?" "It might," Nora said. "Or it might just be that people surprise you when they are at the end of something." Sarah nodded slowly, as if she were testing that explanation against what she knew of her husband, and finding it did not quite fit. Nora shifted the conversation. She asked about Peter's business, about Langley Construction, about the bids they had lost to coal construction over the past year. Sarah answered without hesitation, the way someone answers when the facts are simple and the feelings are too complicated to touch. She said Peter had been frustrated but not angry. He had been worried about money but not desperate. He had talked about scaling back, about focusing on smaller jobs, about maybe selling the business in a few years, and taking a foreman position somewhere else. "That does not sound like a man planning to kill himself," Nora said. Sarah looked out the window. The crows had moved on. The field behind the house was empty and brown and still. "I have been asking myself that all day," she said. I do not know what he was planning. I thought I knew him. Now I am not sure I knew anything. She mentioned Peter's brother, then, unprompted. Mark. She said Peter and Mark had been close, closer than most brothers she knew. They talked every day, sometimes twice a day. Mark was the only person Peter really opened up to about anything. The business, the marriage, the way he felt about getting older and running out of time for the things he had wanted to do. Nora noted the way Sarah said the word marriage. Flat, neutral, as if she were naming a piece of equipment rather than a relationship. Before Nora could follow that thread, the front door opened and closed, footsteps in the hall. A man appeared in the kitchen doorway, younger than Peter would have been by 7 or 8 years, with the same strong jaw and the same careful way of holding his shoulders. Mark Langley. He stopped when he saw Nora, his expression shifting from whatever it had been a moment before to something more guarded. "Mark," Sarah said, "this is Officer Callahan from the local department. She is just asking some questions." Mark looked at Nora with eyes that were not sad. They were cautious, measuring. He nodded once, said he would be in the back if they needed him, and disappeared down the hall toward the rear of the house. Sarah watched him go. Her face did not change. Nora stayed another 20 minutes, asking about Peter's habits, his friends, his schedule in the weeks before his death. Sarah answered everything directly, without evasion, but there was something controlled about the way she did it. Not lying, exactly, just careful, as if she had thought about these questions before Nora arrived and had prepared her answers. When Nora finally stood to leave, Sarah walked her to the door. She did not say thank you for coming. She said, "I hope you find whatever you are looking for." The phrasing was odd, Nora thought, less like a widow hoping for closure, and more like someone who knew there was something to find. Nora sat in her cruiser for a moment after Sarah closed the door. The engine was off. The interior was cold. Through the kitchen window, she could see Sarah and Mark standing together near the sink, their heads close, talking in low voices. Neither of them wanted anyone else to hear. She wrote down the license plate of the Subaru wagon out of habit. She wrote down the time she left. Then she started the engine and pulled back onto the gravel lane, the mud sucking at the tires one last time before she reached the pavement. She did not know yet what she had found, but she knew she had found something. Chapter 3. The Brother. Mark Langley worked out of a small office behind the main workshop on the eastern edge of town, a prefab building with a metal roof and a gravel lot that had turned into a mud pit sometime in the second week of March and would not dry out until May. Nora found him there the next morning, the sky low and gray, a light drizzle falling that was not quite rain and not quite fog, just moisture suspended in the air until it found something to cling to. The door to the office was propped open with a brick. Inside, the space smelled of coffee that had been sitting too long and the particular sharpness of fresh lumber stored somewhere nearby. Mark sat at a metal desk covered in papers, a calculator, 3 coffee mugs in various stages of emptiness, and a photograph of a boat that Nora did not recognize. He looked up when she knocked on the doorframe, and for a second his face was open, tired, unprepared. Then he recognized her, and the caution came back. He did not invite her to sit. Nora sat anyway, in the plastic chair across from his desk, and waited. The conversation started slowly. Mark answered her questions about his alibi without being asked directly, which Nora noted as a tell. He said he had been at a bar in Rockland the night Peter died, a place called The Shoveler, playing pool with 2 friends. He gave her their names. He said they had been there from 9 until last call, and he had slept at his own apartment in Rockland afterward, the one he kept for nights when he worked late on the far side of the county. Nora wrote down the names. She did not say whether she believed him. When she asked about the business, Mark's answers changed. He became more precise, more guarded. He said Peter had been a good contractor, but a bad businessman. He did not know how to say no to people. He underbid jobs to keep relationships and then lost money on the work. Cole Construction had been taking advantage of that for 2 years, swooping in on the contracts Peter should have won, offering lower bids that made no sense until you realized David Cole could afford to lose money on a job if it meant starving out a competitor. Mark said the name David Cole like he was handling something fragile. Not carefully, exactly, more like someone who knew the thing might break if he held it wrong. Nora asked what he meant by that. Mark looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, David Cole was in prison for 5 years. He got out 3 weeks ago. You know that, right? You know who put him there. Nora said nothing. Peter, Mark said. Peter testified against him. Said he saw Cole's truck near the ravine the morning that librarian died. That testimony was the only thing that put him away. Now the forensic evidence is falling apart, and Cole is out on bail, and Peter is dead in a truck with a hose in the window. He stopped. His hands were flat on the desk, fingers spread. You do not have to be a detective to do that math. Nora let the silence stretch. Then she asked, Do you think Peter told the truth 5 years ago? Mark's jaw tightened. I think Peter told what he saw. Whether what he saw was what actually happened, I do not know. Neither does anyone else. That is the problem with eyewitness testimony. It is just one person's word, and sometimes that person is wrong. He did not say liar, he said wrong. Nora filed the difference. She drove back to the station with the windshield wipers on their lowest setting. The drizzle, too light to really need them, but persistent enough to blur the glass if she did not. The roads were empty. The tourists would not come for another 2 months, in March. Harrow Cove belonged to the people who had survived the winter, and they were all indoors, waiting for something to change. Cole called her into his office before she even took her coat off. He was sitting behind his desk with a file open in front of him, the pages covered in the small, neat handwriting he used for case notes. He looked up at her over his reading glasses. Sit down, he said. Nora sat. David Cole was released on bail 23 days ago. He is living in a rented room on the outskirts of Rockland. He has a curfew, 7 in the evening to 7 in the morning. He is wearing a GPS tracker on his ankle, and the car he is allowed to drive has a tracking device as well. His movements are monitored. Nora waited. Peter Langley was the prosecution's key witness in the Cole trial 5 years ago. He testified that he saw David Cole's truck parked near the ravine on the morning Arthur Vance died. Without that testimony, the case against Cole was circumstantial at best. Cole closed the file. The state police are aware of the connection. They are not ignoring it. But they need more than motive and a name. They need evidence. Nora thought about the note, the language that did not match Peter, the tape applied from the outside, the sedan parked near the Langley yard. She did not say any of this yet. She did not have enough. Cole said, I want you to keep talking to people, the family, the employees, anyone who knew Peter well. If there is something connecting David Cole to this scene, it will come through someone who knew what Peter knew. Nora nodded. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. Do you think he did it, David Cole? Cole took off his glasses and set them on the desk. He looked tired, the way he always looked when a case had layers he did not want to dig through. I think a man who spent 5 years in prison for something he may not have done has a reason to be angry. I also think a man who spent 5 years in prison learns things. He learns how to wait. He learns how to plan. He learns how to make something look like something it is not. He put his glasses back on. That is what worries me.
Nora walked back to her desk through the main room of the station, past the dispatcher's window and the bulletin board covered in outdated notices. Through the front windows, she could see the street, the bare trees, the gray sky pressing down on the rooftops. The mud from the station parking lot had been tracked across the floor in long, brown smears, and someone had tried to mop it and only succeeded in spreading it around. She sat down and opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, she wrote 3 things: the note, the tape, the sedan. Then she wrote David Cole's name underneath them, with a question mark beside it. The question mark was honest. She did not know, but she could feel the shape of something forming, the way you could feel the shape of a pot before the clay was fully on the wheel. Just a sense of where the walls would go. She looked out the window again. The drizzle had stopped. The street was wet and dark and empty. Somewhere in Rockland, a man with a GPS tracker on his ankle was waking up to another day of waiting. And Nora wondered what he was thinking about. Chapter 4. Fish Chowder. The kitchen at Ed's house was the warmest room in Harrow Cove that night. Or so it felt to Nora when she stepped through the back door and let the screen smack shut behind her. The rest of the town had been dark and cold when she drove over, the streets empty, the harbor invisible in the blackness beyond the streetlights. Only the smell of low tide telling her it was still there. March in Maine did not let go easily. The days had been teasing toward spring, but the nights remembered everything winter had taught them. Ed stood at the stove in his apron, the one with the faded stain on the front that had been there as long as Nora could remember. Older than her parents' death, older than her childhood, probably older than Ed himself. He was stirring something in a heavy pot, the kind of cast-iron Dutch oven that took 20 years to season properly and another 20 to become truly useful. The smell hit her before she saw what was inside. Onions sweating in butter, the sharp, clean scent of haddock, a hint of thyme and something else. Bay leaf, maybe? Or celery seed. She hung her jacket on the hook by the door and kicked off her boots. The floor was wet where the snowmelt had been tracked in and mopped up, leaving a faint grit under her socks. Biscuit lay on the couch in the corner, his head on his paws, watching her with the particular expression of a dog who had decided the outside was not worth the trouble. He did not get up. He did not thump his tail. He just observed, then closed his eyes and went back to whatever dream he had been having. "Smells good," Nora said. Ed did not turn around. "It will be ready in 20 minutes. Sit down. You look like you have been standing all day." She had been. She sat at the kitchen table, the wood worn smooth by decades of elbows and coffee cups and the occasional wet dog nose. The window above the sink was dark, nothing to see but her own reflection, a pale oval floating in the black glass. The radiator hissed softly against the wall. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked that she had never learned to see, but had heard her whole life. Ed brought 2 bowls to the table without asking whether she wanted to eat. He served the chowder himself, ladling it slowly, making sure each bowl got an equal share of the fish and the potatoes and the broth. That was the kind of thing Ed did. He did not rush food. He did not rush anything. They ate in silence for a few minutes. The chowder was good, the way Ed's cooking always was, simple and careful, and made by someone who had learned to cook for himself decades ago and had never seen a reason to change. The fish flaked apart on Nora's spoon. The broth was rich without being heavy, the potatoes soft but not falling apart. She ate half the bowl before she realized how hungry she had been. Ed set down his spoon. He did not ask about the case. He did not ask about her day. He asked instead about David Cole. "You put him away 5 years ago," he said. "Not you personally, but you were part of it. The department was part of it. Cole was part of it. Now you know he might have been innocent, or at least that the evidence against him might have been wrong." He picked up his spoon again, then set it down without eating. How does that feel? Nora looked at her bowl. The broth had gone still. A film of cream was forming on the surface. I do not know, she said. Ed nodded. That is the right answer. She told him the rest then, not because she had decided to, but because the kitchen was warm and the chowder was good, and Ed had a way of sitting in a chair that made silence feel heavier than talking. She told him about the note and the language that did not match Peter Langley. She told him about the tape, applied from the outside, and the Slim Jim scratch on the door lock that Beaumont had found. She told him about the gray sedan, the rental paid in cash, the way Mark Langley had said David Cole's name like it was a thing that might break. Ed listened without interrupting. He did not ask questions. He did not nod along or make sounds of acknowledgement. He just listened, the way old men who have spent decades learning to be quiet listen, storing everything in a place behind his eyes that Nora had learned to trust. When she finished, he stood up and brought the pot to the table and ladled more chowder into both bowls, even though neither of them had finished the first serving. He sat back down. The note, he said. Tell me about the language again. Exactly what the wife said. Nora thought back. She said Peter was not a man who used words like wait or darkness or failure in that way. He would have said something shorter, something plain. I messed up. I could not fix it. Not a whole sentence built like a book. Ed picked up his spoon and held it without eating. A man who decides to die does not need to choose his words carefully. He does not sit down and think about whether his sentences are well constructed. He just writes. He puts down whatever is in his head. And what is in his head at that moment is not grammar or style. It is pain. It is exhaustion. It is the feeling of a door closing and knowing it will never open again. He looked at her. Someone else wrote that note. Someone who thought about how a suicide note should sound. Someone who had time to choose the words carefully because they were not the one dying. Nora had thought the same thing. Hearing Ed say it made it feel more real, less like a suspicion and more like a fact waiting to be proven. Ed set the spoon down. The question is not whether Peter Langley wrote those words. He did not. The question is who wrote them and why they thought Peter would copy them without fighting. Nora had been thinking about David Cole. She said so. Ed did not disagree. He did not agree either. He stood up and walked to the counter and poured himself a glass of water, the tap running for a long time before he filled the glass, as if he wanted the sound of it to fill the room for a moment. When he came back to the table, he said, "A man who has been locked up for 5 years does not forget how to wait. He has done nothing but wait. Every day in prison is waiting for something. A meal, a letter, a visit that never comes, the end of a sentence that keeps getting longer the more you think about it." He sat down. The question is not whether David Cole had the patience to plan this. The question is whether he learned anything else in there, whether he came out the same man who went in, or whether 5 years changed him in ways nobody has thought to look for. Nora thought about that. She thought about David Cole walking into the courthouse in Rockland, his back straight, his face unreadable. He had looked like a man who had learned something. Yes, but she did not know what. Biscuit jumped down from the couch then, which was unusual enough to draw both their attention. The old beagle padded across the floor and stuck his nose against Nora's ankle, sniffing once, twice, then turned and walked back to the couch. He did not curl up again. He stood on the cushion and looked out the dark window, his ears forward, his tail still. Ed watched the dog. He knows something is different tonight. He can feel it in the air. The thaw does that to animals. They get restless before the ground finishes waking up. Outside, the wind picked up, just a little, just enough to rattle the screen door in its frame.
The sound was soft and rhythmic, a loose piece of metal tapping against wood. Nothing that needed fixing, but nothing that would stop on its own either. Nora finished her chowder. Ed did not push her to talk more. He took her bowl and his own and carried them to the sink, where he ran water over them and left them in the basin to soak. He did not wash them. That was another thing Ed did. He let things sit. She put on her jacket and her boots, the laces stiff from the wet, and stood at the back door for a moment before opening it. The kitchen was behind her, warm and yellow and smelling of fish and thyme. The night was in front of her, cold and dark and full of questions she did not have answers to yet. "Thank you for the chowder," she said. Ed was already sitting back down at the table, his hands wrapped around his glass of water, his eyes on something in the middle distance that Nora could not see. "Come back when you have more questions," he said. "I will still be here." She stepped out into the dark. The ground was soft under her boots, the kind of soft that came from a day of sun and a night of freezing. The top layer stiff, but the mud underneath still holding the shape of every footstep. The cruiser's engine turned over on the second try, and she sat with her hands on the wheel for a minute before she put it in gear. The road back to her place was empty, the houses dark. The only light coming from a single porch lamp at the end of the street that flickered on and off in a rhythm she had never been able to predict. She drove slowly, the tires sinking slightly with each rotation, the sound of the mud releasing them like something reluctant to let go. She thought about Ed's question, not whether David Cole had the patience to plan, but what he had learned in 5 years. Patience was one thing, but 5 years in a cell taught other lessons too. It taught a man how to hide, how to wait for the right moment, how to make something look like something it was not. Peter Langley's suicide looked like a suicide. The note was in his handwriting, the hose was connected, the truck was parked where nobody would find it for hours. It looked exactly like a man at the end of his rope. That was what worried her. It looked too much like one. She turned onto her street and parked in front of the small house she rented from a woman who spent winters in Florida and did not care what happened to the property as long as the checks cleared. The porch light was on, left over from the night before, and moths were already beginning to find it, even though the season had barely turned. She sat in the cruiser for a long moment, the engine off, the interior cooling rapidly, the windows fogging from her breath. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called once and then stopped. The silence that followed was complete and heavy. The kind of silence that only happens in places where the nearest neighbor is a quarter mile away and the nearest streetlight is further than that. She went inside. She did not turn on the lights. She sat on the couch in the dark and thought about David Cole, about Peter Langley, about a note written in handwriting that belonged to a dead man but used words that had never been his. She thought about what Ed had not said. He had not told her whether she was right to suspect Cole. He had not pointed her in any direction at all. He had simply asked a question, the way he always did, and trusted her to find her own way to the answer. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the loose storm window in the bedroom. Nora lay down on the couch and pulled the blanket from the back of it over her legs. She did not sleep. She just lay there, listening to the house settle around her, and waited for morning to come and tell her what to do next. Chapter 5. The Curfew. The state police office in Rockland was a low brick building set back from the road behind a parking lot that had been plowed so many times over the winter that the asphalt had started to crack. Nora arrived before 9, the sky still the color of old pewter. The temperature just warm enough that the frost on her windshield had melted into streaks by the time she parked. Cole had called ahead. Beaumont was waiting for her at the front desk with a visitor badge and a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime the day before. She drank it anyway. Beaumont led her to a small conference room on the second floor, windowless,
lit by overhead fluorescents that hummed in a key that seemed designed to give people headaches. A file folder sat on the table, thick enough that Nora could see the edge of a tab sticking out where someone had misfiled a page. He opened it and spread the contents across the surface. Bail conditions, GPS logs, court orders, a photograph of David Cole taken the day he was released. His face flat and unreadable against the gray wall of the processing room. Cole is required to wear an ankle monitor at all times, Beaumont said, tapping the relevant section of the bail order. The device pings every 15 minutes. The data goes to a private monitoring company contracted by the court, but we can access the logs with a warrant. We got one this morning. He slid a printout across the table. Nora picked it up. The logs were dense but readable, each line showing a timestamp and a set of coordinates. She scanned the column for the night Peter Langley died. David Cole's ankle monitor placed him at his rented room in Rockland from 7 in the evening until 7 the next morning. No movement, no deviation, just a single dot on a map. Sitting inside 4 walls for 12 hours. She set the printout down. The monitor is on his ankle. That tracks his body, not just his car. Yes, Beaumont said. He did not sound satisfied. But the car has a separate tracker, a condition of his bail. The vehicle assigned to him has a GPS device installed on the OBD port. Beaumont nodded. We checked that too. The car never left Rockland. It was parked outside his residence the entire night. Nora looked at the printout again. The coordinates were consistent. The timeline was solid. If David Cole had killed Peter Langley, he had done it without leaving his room and without moving his car. That was not possible, or at least not possible in any way that Nora could see. She asked to see the rental agreement for the gray sedan. Beaumont raised his eyebrows. The one you called about from the scene. The one I saw parked near the Langley yard the morning after Peter died. I wrote down the plate. It came back to a rental agency in Rockland, paid in cash. Beaumont made a note on the pad he carried in his breast pocket, a small spiral notebook with a bent cover that looked like it had been through a lot of cases. He said he would have someone pull the records and check for any connection to Cole, but he did not sound optimistic. Cash rentals were hard to trace. The agencies kept the minimum required information, often just a driver's license number that could be fake or stolen. Nora thanked him and asked about the duct tape. Beaumont opened another section of the file. The medical examiner's preliminary report was there, 3 pages of dense text followed by a photograph of the passenger window taken from the outside. The tape wraps were visible in the image, each layer overlapping the next in a careful spiral pattern. The analyst had noted that the application was consistent with someone standing outside the vehicle, the angle of the wrap, the tension on the adhesive, the way the tape had been pressed into the crevice between the glass and the frame. All of it pointed to an external application. The final report will take another week, Beaumont said, but the ME is confident enough to say that a person sitting in the driver's seat could not have applied the tape that way, not without leaving the vehicle first, which would have defeated the purpose. Nora turned the page. There was a second photograph, this one of the driver's side door lock, magnified to show a faint scratch in the metal. Beaumont had circled it in red pen. The scratch was thin and consistent with a Slim Jim tool, the kind of thin metal strip used to manipulate car door locks from the outside. Someone had opened Peter Langley's truck after it was locked, or locked it after Peter was already inside. The tool marks are consistent with entry, Beaumont said, but the orientation of the scratch suggests the door was locked from the outside after the tool was removed. Whoever used it did not break in. They sealed up. Nora sat back in her chair. The fluorescent lights hummed above her. The coffee had gone cold in her hand, and she set it down on the table, leaving a ring on the glossy surface of the file folder. "What about the sedan?" she asked. "Has anyone traced it?" Beaumont shook his head. "Not yet. The rental agency's camera system was not working that week. They have a sign on the door saying so. The clerk remembers a man renting a gray sedan with cash, but he cannot describe him beyond average height, average build, probably in his 50s. No name, no license, nothing. Nora thought about David Cole's ankle monitor. She thought about the car tracker. She thought about the gray sedan that had been paid for in cash and driven by someone who did not want to be seen. If Cole had killed Peter Langley, he had done it without violating his curfew, without moving his assigned vehicle, and without leaving a trace of his identity at the rental agency. That was not impossible. It was just careful. Very careful. She called the rental agency herself from the conference room phone, using the number Beaumont gave her. The clerk who answered sounded young and tired, like someone who had been working the morning shift for too many years. He confirmed what Beaumont had told her. Cash rental, no ID. The car had been returned the morning after Peter Langley died. Early, before the sun was fully up. It had been cleaned out. There was nothing in it. Nora asked about the condition of the car. The clerk paused. Then he said, "There was mud on the undercarriage, more than usual for a car that had been driven around town. And the rear tires had caked mud in the treads, the kind that takes a while to build up. I figured he had been on some back roads." "Did you clean it off?" "Of course. We have to return the car in rentable condition. But I remember because it took longer than usual. The mud was thick, clay heavy, not like the stuff around here." Nora wrote that down. Clay heavy, not like the stuff around Rockland. She thought of the logging road where Peter Langley had died, the deep ruts, the gray-brown mud that had preserved the tire tracks. The road was 2 miles past the town line, in an area where the soil was known for its high clay content, heavy and dense and slow to dry. She thanked the clerk and hung up. By the time she returned to the conference room, Beaumont had received a call from the crime lab. The preliminary analysis of the tire tracks from the logging road was in. The second set of tracks, the ones from the sedan that had parked near Peter's truck, matched a common all-season tire available on most domestic sedans. That did not narrow anything down. But the soil embedded in the tire impressions was consistent with the logging road itself, which was not surprising. What was surprising was that the lab had also found traces of the same clay soil on the undercarriage of a gray sedan that had been returned to a rental agency in Rockland the morning after the death. Beaumont looked at Nora. The rental agency washed the car, but they missed a spot near the rear axle. The lab is running a full comparison now. Nora did not say anything. She did not need to. The connection was not yet complete. There was still a gap between the gray sedan and David Cole, but the gap was getting smaller. She drove back to Harrow Cove in the early afternoon, the sun finally breaking through the clouds, throwing long shadows across the road that looked like fingers reaching toward the tree line. The snow was gone from the fields, replaced by wet brown earth and the first hints of green where the hardiest weeds had decided to take their chances. The harbor master's truck was parked at the end of the pier, and a single lobster boat was heading out toward the open water, its wake spreading behind it in a wide V. When she got back to the station, Cole was on the phone. He held up one finger when she walked in, then finished his call and hung up. "The medical examiner's office called while you were out," he said. "The duct tape analysis is official now. Applied from the outside. No way around it." Nora nodded. "I know. Beaumont showed me." Cole sat back in his chair and looked at her for a long moment. "The state police want us to continue local support. They are not ready to call this a homicide yet, but they are not calling it a suicide either. They want us to keep talking to people, to keep listening." And David Cole. His alibi is solid on paper. The ankle monitor, the car tracker, both say he was in Rockland all night. Cole paused. But paper only tells you what the devices recorded. It does not tell you whether a man can be in 2 places at once. Nora thought about the gray sedan, about the mud on the undercarriage, about the clerk who said the driver had been on back roads. She asked Cole whether anyone had checked the door locks on Peter's truck for scratches. Cole picked up the phone and called Beaumont. He asked the question without preamble, listened for a moment, then hung up. He looked at Nora. There are scratches on the driver's side door lock, faint, consistent with a Slim Jim tool. Beaumont says they missed it on the first pass because of the lighting at the scene. A second look found it this morning. Nora sat down in the chair across from Cole's desk. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The case was not solved. The evidence was not complete. But the shape of it was becoming clearer, the way a photograph emerges slowly in a dark-room tray. Pale shapes at first, then edges, then a face that you recognize even before you see all the details. She thought about Ed's question. What had David Cole learned in 5 years? The answer, she was beginning to think, was everything he needed to know. Chapter 6. The Phone Call. The station emptied out slowly that evening, the way it always did when a case had no clear end and no one wanted to be the first to leave. Cole stayed at his desk until 6:30, reading through the medical examiner's preliminary report for the third time. His reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, his expression the same blank neutrality he wore during traffic court. The dispatcher, a woman named Darlene, who had been working the overnight shift for 22 years and had seen everything twice, packed her bag at 7 and wished Nora a quiet night. By 7:15, the only light in the building came from the single fixture over Nora's desk and the blue glow of the radio console in the dispatch room. She had been writing her report for the past hour, summarizing the interviews with Sarah and Mark Langley, the information from Beaumont, the rental agency records, the tire track analysis. The words came slowly. Her handwriting was neat but small, the kind of script that saved space on the page without sacrificing legibility, a habit she had picked up from Ed years ago. He wrote the same way, she remembered. Small, precise, as if every word cost something. The duct tape report sat on the corner of her desk, the official copy that had arrived by fax that afternoon. The language was clinical, dense with terms she had to read twice to understand, but the conclusion was clear. The tape had been applied by someone standing outside the vehicle. The angle of the wrap, the pressure points on the adhesive, the direction of the overlap, all of it pointed away from a person sitting in the driver's seat. The analyst had used the phrase, inconsistent with self-application, 3 times in 2 pages. She underlined it once in pencil, then set the report aside. She had 3 clues now, solid and documented. The note, with words that did not belong to Peter Langley. The tape applied from the outside. The Slim Jim scratch on the driver's side door lock. 3 separate pieces of evidence, each pointing away from suicide and toward something else. Toward someone else. The gray sedan was still a loose thread. It connected to the scene through the mud on its undercarriage, the clay-heavy soil that matched the logging road. It connected to the rental agency through a cash payment and a clerk who could not describe the driver. But it did not yet connect to David Cole. Not directly. The ankle monitor said Cole had been in Rockland all night. The car tracker said his assigned vehicle had not moved. Unless Cole had found a way to be in 2 places at once, or unless someone else had driven that sedan, the connection would not hold. Nora wrote David Cole's name on a fresh page of her notebook, then drew a question mark beside it. Underneath, she wrote the word alibi in capital letters, then circled it. The ankle monitor was the problem. The ankle monitor was also the solution, if she could find a way around it. But the monitor tracked his body, not just his vehicle. He could not remove it without alerting the monitoring company. He could not disable it without sending a tamper signal.
The device was designed to prevent exactly the kind of movement that would have been required to drive to Harrow Cove. Park on a logging road and wait for Peter Langley to die. She set her pen down and rubbed her eyes. The fluorescent light above her desk had started to flicker, a barely perceptible pulse that she had not noticed until now, when the rest of the station was dark and quiet, and her concentration had begun to fray at the edges. She would have to tell Cole about the flickering tomorrow, or she would not. Either way, it did not matter tonight. The phone rang. The sound was sharp in the empty station, louder than it should have been, the kind of ring that came through the old handset on the dispatch desk, the one that had been there since before Nora was born. Darlene was gone. Cole was gone. Nora was the only person in the building. She stood up and walked to the dispatch desk, her footsteps echoing on the linoleum, and picked up the receiver. Harrow Cove Police Department. A pause. Static. Then a voice she knew better than almost any other voice in the world. "Hey, Nor. Jamie." Her brother. He sounded different. Not older, exactly, though he was older, the way everyone was older than the last time she had heard them. He sounded quieter, slower, as if the words cost him something to say, the way her handwriting cost her something when she was tired and the case was not going the way she wanted. "Jamie." She sat down in Darlene's chair, the cushion still warm from the dispatcher's body heat. "Are you okay?" Another pause. More static. The connection was bad, the way long-distance calls always were when they came from wherever Jamie was stationed, a place he never named and she had stopped asking about years ago. "Yeah," he said. "I am okay. I just wanted to hear your voice." Nora closed her eyes. The station was dark around her. The only light came from the flickering fixture over her desk, casting shadows that moved slowly across the floor, like something breathing. "When do you call?" she asked. "What time is it there?" "It does not matter what time it is." He paused again. "I am getting leave soon. Not sure exactly when. Maybe a month. Maybe 2. But I am coming home. Nor, I am coming back to Harrow Cove." She did not say anything. Her hand tightened on the receiver, the plastic warm against her palm, and she felt something in her chest shift, the way a house settles when the foundation has been holding a weight it was not designed to carry. "Are you still there?" Jamie asked. "Still here," she said. "I am always still here." He laughed at that, a short sound, almost surprised, as if he had not expected her to say something that sounded like her. "I know you are. That is why I called." The static grew louder. The line crackled with something that sounded like wind, or maybe interference from 1,000 miles of copper wire and satellite relays and systems Nora did not understand and had never tried to understand. Jamie said something else, but the words broke up before they reached her, fragmenting into syllables that did not quite connect. "You are breaking up," she said. "I know." His voice was faint now, distant, the way voices sounded when they were already leaving. "I will call again soon. I promise." The line went dead. Nora sat in the dark for a long time after she hung up, the receiver still in her hand, the dial tone humming in the quiet station. She set it back in the cradle slowly, carefully, the way you handled something that might break if you treated it roughly. Jamie was coming home. Maybe a month, maybe 2. She had heard those words before, or versions of them, in letters and voicemails, and the occasional crackling phone call from bases she could not pronounce. But this time felt different. This time his voice had been quieter, slower, as if he had made a decision and was not planning to change his mind. She walked back to her desk and sat down. The notebook was still open to the page with David Cole's name and the question mark and the word alibi circled in pencil. She looked at it for a moment,
then folded the page along the crease and tucked the notebook into her coat pocket. The station was cold now. The radiators had stopped ticking, their heat long since dissipated into the dark, and the windows had begun to fog from the moisture in the air. She turned off the light over her desk, and the room went black except for the blue glow of the radio console and the faint gray light from the street outside. She put on her coat. She walked to the door. She did not look back. The air outside was cold and clean, the way coastal air got after a day of wind and a night of clear skies. The salt and the pine and the distant smell of low tide all mixing together into something that felt like home. The mud in the parking lot had begun to freeze in the shallow ruts, the surface crusting over with a thin layer of ice that cracked under her boots as she walked to the cruiser. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. The street was empty. The harbor was invisible in the dark, but she could hear the water moving against the pilings, a soft, rhythmic sound that had been there her whole life and would be there long after she was gone. Jamie was coming home. She started the engine and pulled out of the lot, the tires crunching over the frozen mud, and drove toward the road that led out of town. She did not know where she was going. She did not need to know. The roads of Harrow Cove would take her where she needed to be, the same way they always had, the same way they always would. In her pocket, the notebook sat folded and silent. David Cole's name was still there, waiting for her to come back to it. And she would, but not tonight. Tonight, she drove through the dark and listened to the harbor breathe, and thought about a brother who had finally decided to come home. Chapter 7. The Courthouse. She left before dawn the next morning, driving south on Route 17, while the sky was still the deep gray that came just before the sun decided whether to show itself. The roads were empty except for a single salt truck heading the opposite direction, its spreader throwing a thin cloud of sand onto the pavement, the grains ticking against her windshield like static on a radio. She had not told Cole where she was going. She was not sure she could have explained it if he had asked. The courthouse in Rockland was a granite building from the 1920s, square and unornamented, the kind of architecture that seemed designed to remind everyone who entered that the law was heavy and slow and indifferent to the weather. Nora parked across the street, in a spot that gave her a clear view of the main entrance, and turned off the engine. The cruiser was cold. She had not brought coffee. She sat with her hands in her coat pockets and waited. David Cole had a bail hearing that morning. She had seen it on the docket when Beaumont left his file open on the conference room table. Not hidden, not secret, just a date and a time and a courtroom number typed in the corner of a page. She had not planned to come. She had told herself she would not come. But the drive south had happened anyway, her hands on the wheel and her foot on the gas, as if the car had decided for her. The first cars arrived at 8:15, lawyers in dark coats, their breath fogging in the cold air, clutching briefcases and coffee cups, and the particular expression of people who spent their lives arguing about things that mattered only to the people involved. A woman in a green jacket stood near the steps, smoking a cigarette with quick, nervous drags, her eyes scanning the street the way people scanned when they were waiting for someone they did not particularly want to see. Nora watched and waited. The sedan pulled up at 8:30, a gray car, but not the gray car. This one newer and cleaner, and driven by a woman in a blue blazer who parked in the lot reserved for court employees. Nora watched her walk inside. She watched a young man in a hoodie jog across the street, his sneakers slapping the pavement, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. She watched a woman with a stroller struggle with a heavy door until someone inside held it open for her. None of them were David Cole. She almost missed him. He came from the side street, not the main road, walking slowly along the sidewalk with his head down and his hands in the pockets of a black coat that looked too thin for the weather. He was alone, no lawyer beside him, no family, no entourage of supporters carrying signs or chanting his name. Just a man in a thin coat, walking to his own bail hearing because there was no one else to walk with him. He looked older than she remembered. 5 years in prison had done what 5 years anywhere else would have done, added lines to his face and gray to his hair, and a certain carefulness to his movements that had not been there before. But there was something else, too, something that the years inside had given him rather than taken away. He walked with a slight limp on his left side, a hesitation in his stride that had not been there the last time she had seen him in a courtroom. The old construction injury, she remembered. Something about an accident 12 years ago. The limp was more pronounced now. Either it had worsened over time, or he had stopped pretending it did not hurt. Nora watched him cross the street. He did not look at the cruiser. He did not look at anything except the courthouse steps, his eyes fixed on the entrance as if he were counting the stairs, measuring the distance, preparing himself for whatever was waiting inside. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. For a moment, just a moment, he stood still, his shoulders rising and falling with a single deep breath. Then he started up. The limp was more visible on the stairs. His left foot dragged slightly on each step, catching on the edge of the granite, forcing him to compensate with his right leg in a way that looked painful and practiced. He had been doing this for a long time, Nora realized. The limp was not new. The limp had been there for years, hidden by boots and work pants and the particular way construction workers moved when they were on a job site. Always in motion, always too busy to notice the small betrayals of their own bodies. He disappeared through the courthouse doors. The woman in the green jacket had finished her cigarette and gone inside. The man in the hoodie was already through security. The street was empty again, the only movement coming from a cluster of pigeons pecking at something in the gutter. Nora sat in the cruiser and thought about the last time she had seen David Cole. She had been 18 years old, a first-year criminal justice student at the community college in Portland, sitting in the back of a courtroom because her grandfather had told her that watching trials was better than reading about them. She had not understood what he meant then. She understood now. The trial had lasted 2 weeks. The evidence had been circumstantial at best, but Peter Langley had taken the stand and spoken in a clear, steady voice about seeing David Cole's truck near the ravine on the morning Arthur Vance died. He had not hesitated. He had not looked at the defendant. He had looked at the jury and told them what he saw. And the jury had believed him. Nora had believed him too. Everyone had. Now she was not sure. The hearing lasted 45 minutes. Nora did not go inside. She stayed in the cruiser with the engine off and the windows fogging from her breath, watching the courthouse doors, waiting for him to come out. She did not know what she was looking for. Some sign, maybe. Some crack in the facade that would tell her whether the man walking into that building was a killer or a victim or something in between. When the doors opened again, he was still alone. He walked down the steps the same way he had walked up them, slowly, carefully, his left foot dragging slightly on each descent. His face was unchanged. Whatever had happened inside, whatever arguments had been made or decisions delayed, he had not let it show. He walked to the side street and turned left and disappeared around the corner without looking back. Nora did not follow him. She had no reason to follow him. She had no warrant, no probable cause, no justification beyond a feeling that had been growing in her chest since the moment she saw the duct tape on the passenger window of Peter Langley's truck. A feeling was not evidence. A feeling would not hold up in court. She started the engine and pulled away from the curb. The drive back to Harrow Cove took 40 minutes, the sun finally breaking through the clouds somewhere around the town line, throwing pale yellow light across the fields and the bare trees and the first patches of green where the grass had decided winter was over. The harbor was bright when she reached it, the water reflecting the sky in shades of gray and silver, the fishing boats at the pier rocking gently against their moorings. She parked behind the station and sat for a moment, her hands still on the wheel, her eyes on the mud coating the cruiser's tires. The clay was thick and brown and heavy, the same mud that had been on the undercarriage of the gray sedan, the same mud that had preserved the tire tracks on the logging road. Mud was just dirt and water. It did not solve cases. It did not tell you who had parked where or why. But sometimes it remembered things that people wanted to forget. She went inside and called the rental agency again. The same clerk answered, the same tired voice, the same careful way of speaking that suggested he had been warned by his manager not to say too much. Nora asked about the security cameras again. The clerk said they were still broken. She asked about the condition of the car again. The clerk said he had already told her everything he remembered. She asked whether anyone else had rented the same model of sedan in the days before Peter Langley died. The clerk paused. Then he said, "There was one other. Same make, same model, different color, blue. Rented by a woman, paid with a credit card. She returned it the day before your guy's car was picked up." Nora wrote down the name on the credit card receipt. It was a woman from Massachusetts. No connection to Harrow Cove, no connection to David Cole. Almost certainly nothing. But she wrote it down anyway, and she filed it away, and she did not forget it. She sat at her desk and looked at her notebook. The page with David Cole's name was still folded in her pocket. She took it out and smoothed it flat on the desk and looked at the question mark she had drawn beside his name. She had watched him walk into a courthouse that morning. She had watched him walk out. He had looked like a man who had been waiting for something for a very long time. She did not know whether that something was justice or revenge or just an end to the waiting. But she knew now that she needed to find out. Chapter 8. The Nest Egg. The state police returned to Harrow Cove on a Thursday morning, 3 days after Peter Langley's body was found. Beaumont had requested a second interview with Mark Langley, this time at the station rather than at the construction yard, and he had asked Nora to sit in. Cole agreed. He said it would be good for her to see how state investigators worked when they stopped being polite and started pressing. The interview room was the same one the department used for everything, a small windowless space with a scarred wooden table and 4 mismatched chairs. The camera in the corner blinked red. Recording. Beaumont sat across from Mark Langley, his posture relaxed, his voice even. Another trooper, a woman named Harrison, sat beside him taking notes. Nora positioned herself near the door, where she could watch Mark's face without being directly in his line of sight. Mark looked worse than he had at the office. His shirt was wrinkled. His eyes had dark circles underneath them, the kind that came from several nights of bad sleep. He had not shaved. He sat with his arms crossed over his chest, his shoulders hunched forward, a posture that said he expected to be hit and was trying to make himself smaller to absorb the blow. Beaumont started with easy questions. Where were you on the night your brother died? Who were you with? What time did you leave the bar? Mark answered each one with the same flat monotone, reciting facts he had clearly gone over in his head many times. The bar was The Shoveler. His friends were Danny Merrill and Craig Haskins. They played pool until last call, around 1 in the morning. He slept at his apartment in Rockland. He did not drive back to Harrow Cove. He did not see Peter that night. He did not know who did. Beaumont let the silence sit. Then he changed directions. Your brother's business, he said. Langley Construction. How was it doing? Mark hesitated. The hesitation was small,
a fraction of a second, but Nora caught it. It was fine. Not great, but fine. We were losing bids, but we had enough work to stay afloat. Enough work to pay your salary. Yes. Enough work to cover the money you had been moving into a separate account. The room went still. Mark's face did not change, not visibly, but something behind his eyes shifted. He looked at Beaumont, then at Harrison, then at Nora. He was calculating, she could see it, trying to figure out how much they knew and whether denial was still an option. Beaumont slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a bank statement, the name Langley Construction at the top, a series of transfers highlighted in yellow. The amounts were small, a few $1,000s here, a few thousand there, adding up over 2 years to something closer to 50,000 than 40. Mark looked at the paper. His crossed arms tightened. I can explain that, he said. Good. Beaumont said, that is why we are here, Mark explained. The explanation came out in fragments, a confession that kept trying to stop and then restarting, like a car with a bad starter. He had been skimming money from the business for 2 years, small amounts he thought Peter would not notice. He had been building a nest egg, he said, a cushion, something to fall back on when he finally got tired of being the younger brother, the one who did the work, while Peter took the credit and made the decisions. Did Peter know? Beaumont asked. No, I do not think so. He was not good with numbers. He left the books to me. Beaumont nodded. He asked about Sarah next, and Mark's face changed again. The defensiveness faded, replaced by something closer to resignation. He admitted the affair. He said it had started 18 months ago, after a company party, and had continued ever since. They had been careful. They had been planning to tell Peter together, to ask for a buyout, to leave Harrow Cove and start over somewhere else. Were you planning to kill him? Beaumont asked. Mark looked up. His eyes were red, but not wet. No, I never wanted him dead. I wanted him out of the way. There is a difference. Beaumont asked about the night of the death again. Mark gave the same alibi. Beaumont asked about David Cole. Mark said he had already told Nora everything he knew. Beaumont asked if Mark had any reason to believe Peter had lied in the trial 5 years ago. Mark was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Peter believed what he said. Whether it was true or not, I do not know, but he believed it. The interview ended 40 minutes after it started. Beaumont thanked Mark for his time and told him not to leave the county without notifying the state police. Mark stood up slowly, his movements stiff, and walked to the door. He paused beside Nora, his hand on the frame. I did not kill my brother, he said. His voice was low, meant only for her. I loved my brother, but I was tired of being invisible. Then he was gone. Nora stood in the hallway after the door closed. Beaumont came out behind her, tucking his notebook into his jacket pocket. His alibi checks out, he said. The friends from the bar confirmed the timeline. The apartment building has a security camera that shows him coming home at 1:30 and not leaving until morning. He is not our guy. The wife. Same. She was home alone, but the neighbor across the street saw her lights on until midnight. Not an alibi. Exactly, but consistent with someone who stayed put. Beaumont shook his head. They have secrets, both of them. The affair, the stolen money, but they did not kill Peter Langley. Nora nodded. She had known that, somehow, before the interview started. The red herrings had done their work, pointing in one direction while the truth moved in another. But the work of a good investigator was not just following the evidence. It was also eliminating the people who looked guilty but were not. She went back to her desk and sat down. The notebook was open to the page where she had written David Cole's name. The question mark was still there. The word alibi was still circled. She stared at it for a long moment.
then picked up her phone and called the rental agency one more time.
The clerk who answered was not the same man she had spoken to before. This one was older, more careful, less willing to talk. But when Nora asked about the security cameras again, he said something the first clerk had not mentioned. The cameras were broken the week the gray sedan was rented, he said. But we have a backup system, motion activated. It only records when someone walks past the front desk. We forgot about it until the owner asked us to check. Nora's hand tightened on the phone. Was there footage from the day the sedan was picked up? There was. It is not great. The angle is bad and the resolution is low. But you can see the person who rented the car. Can you describe him? The clerk paused. Average height, average build, older, maybe 50s. He walked with a slight limp, left leg. Not a bad limp, just a little hitch in his stride, like an old injury. Nora wrote it down. Limp, left leg, old injury. She thanked the clerk and hung up. Then she called Cole. He was in his office, the door half closed, the radio on his desk playing soft, classical music that he claimed helped him think. She knocked once and walked in without waiting for an answer. David Cole has a limp, she said. Left leg, old construction injury from 12 years ago. The rental agency's backup camera caught the person who rented the gray sedan. The clerk says he walked with a slight limp on the left. Cole looked at her over his reading glasses. He did not say anything. He reached for the file on his desk, the one marked Cole, David, and flipped through it until he found the page he was looking for. He read it once, then again, then set it down. The injury is documented. He said he was treated at Maine General in Rockland for a fractured left fibula. The limp never fully resolved. It is mentioned in his intake paperwork from the prison. Nora sat down across from him. The sedan was rented with cash. The driver had a limp. The mud on the undercarriage matches the logging road. The tape on the window was applied from the outside. The note was not written by Peter Langley. The door lock was opened with a slim jim. Cole closed the file. You are building a case. I am trying to. He was quiet for a moment. The classical music played on, something slow and orchestral that Nora did not recognize. Then he picked up the phone and dialed Beaumont's number. We need to talk about David Cole, he said. And we need to talk about how a man with an ankle monitor can be in two places at once. Nora stood at the window while Cole talked. The parking lot outside was wet and gray, the last of the morning frost melting under a sun that was trying to break through the clouds. The mud was starting to dry in the tire tracks, the surface cracking into patterns that looked like a map of somewhere she had never been. Harrow Cove was waking up slowly, the way it always did in late March, the town stretching and blinking and remembering that spring was coming whether it was ready or not. She thought about David Cole walking up the courthouse steps, his left foot dragging slightly on each stair. She thought about the gray sedan parked near the Langley yard, the one she had seen on the morning after Peter died. She thought about a man who had spent 5 years in prison learning how to wait, how to plan, how to make something look like something it was not. Cole hung up the phone. Beaumont is pulling the rental agency footage. He wants to see the limp for himself, if it matches Cole's gait. We have a connection. Nora turned from the window. The ankle monitor still does not make sense. No, Cole said, it does not. But maybe that is because we are thinking about it wrong. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. The monitor tracks his body. It does not track his mind. And a man who has been planning something for 5 years does not need to be in two places at once. He just needs to know how to make it look like he was somewhere he was not. Nora sat with that for a moment. She did not have the answer yet, but she could feel it coming, the way you could feel the tide turning before the water actually started to move.
It was out there, just beyond the horizon, and all she had to do was wait. She went back to her desk and opened her notebook. On a fresh page, she wrote 4 words: the limp, the tape, the note, the scratches. Underneath, she drew a line and wrote David Cole's name. For the first time, she wrote it without a question mark. Chapter 9: The Weight of Waiting. The briefing started at 8 in the morning, in the same conference room at the state police barracks where Nora had first reviewed David Cole's bail conditions. Beaumont had called it as soon as the rental agency footage arrived, burned onto a disc in a format that required 3 attempts before the computer would play it. The video was grainy and dark, shot from a fixed camera positioned above the front desk, the angle so steep that faces appeared as pale ovals with dark smudges where features should have been. But the walk was clear enough. The man who rented the gray sedan moved across the frame at a slow, deliberate pace. He kept his head down, his shoulders hunched, as if he knew the camera was there and wanted to give it as little as possible. But he could not hide the way his left foot dragged on each step. The hitch was subtle, the kind of thing you might miss if you were not looking for it. But Nora had been looking for it. She had watched David Cole walk up the courthouse steps. She had watched him walk down. The men in the video moved the same way. Beaumont paused the footage. The lab is running a gait analysis, but I do not need a lab to tell me what I am looking at. That is David Cole. Nora sat at the table, her notebook open in front of her, the pages covered in the small, neat handwriting she had filled over the past week. Cole sat beside her, his reading glasses on, his expression unreadable. Harrison, the trooper who had taken notes during the Mark Langley interview, sat across from them, with a laptop open to a file that seemed to go on forever. Beaumont walked them through the evidence in order, the way a prosecutor would present it to a jury. The duct tape, applied from the outside, the Slim Jim scratch on the driver's side door lock, the suicide note, in Peter Langley's handwriting, but using language Peter never would have chosen. The gray sedan, rented with cash, returned the morning after the death with mud on its undercarriage. The gait analysis, still preliminary but already pointing directly at David Cole. And the mud itself, the heavy clay soil from the logging road, matched to the sample taken from the sedan's rear axle. That is a lot of coincidences, Beaumont said. Too many for a man who has an airtight alibi, Nora spoke up. His alibi is only as airtight as his ankle monitor. Beaumont looked at her. The monitoring company confirms the device never left his residence. The GPS data is continuous. There are no gaps, no tamper alerts, no anomalies. The monitor tracks his ankle, Nora said. It does not track his hands. It does not track his face. It does not track whether the person wearing it is actually David Cole or someone else he convinced to help him. The room went quiet. Beaumont sat back in his chair. He rubbed his chin with his thumb, a gesture Nora had come to recognize as his thinking face. You are suggesting he had an accomplice. I am suggesting we do not know what he learned in 5 years in prison. He had time to plan. He had time to make friends. He had time to figure out how to be in 2 places at once. She paused. Or at least, how to make it look that way. Harrison spoke from behind her laptop. The rental agency records show the sedan was picked up at 6 in the evening and returned at 7 the next morning. The window for the murder is roughly 10 at night to 2 in the morning. Based on the medical examiner's estimate of time of death, if Cole was wearing the monitor in Rockland during those hours, he could not have been on the logging road, unless the monitor was not on his ankle. Nora said. Beaumont shook his head. The device sends a continuous signal. It is designed to detect removal. If he took it off, the company would have been notified within minutes. Nora had thought about that. She had thought about it for 3 days, turning it over in her mind the way you turned over a rock to see what was underneath. The device is tamper-resistant, but it is not tamper-proof, and a man who spent 5 years in prison has had plenty of time to learn its weaknesses. Beaumont was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. Nora did not hear the conversation. She watched his face instead, the way his jaw tightened and then relaxed, the way his eyes narrowed and then widened. He was a good investigator, she thought. He did not want David Cole to be guilty, but he wanted the truth more than he wanted to be right. He hung up and looked at Nora. The monitoring company is sending a technician to inspect the device. If there is any evidence of tampering, we will find it. The rest of the briefing focused on logistics. Beaumont wanted to bring Cole in for another interview, this time at the state police barracks, with a lawyer present. He wanted to present the evidence in person, to watch Cole's face when he saw the footage, to see whether the limp was enough to break him. Nora agreed, but she asked for one more piece of evidence first: the mud on the rental car. She said, "We have a match to the logging road, but we need something that ties Cole directly to the car. Fingerprints, DNA, something that puts him in the driver's seat." Beaumont nodded. "The crime lab is processing the car today. They found a cigarette butt in the ashtray. It does not match Cole's DNA on file from his prison intake, but that does not mean anything. He could have smoked a different brand. He could have asked someone else to drive." Nora wrote that down. The cigarette butt. She filed it away. The briefing ended at 10. Cole drove her back to Harrow Cove in silence, the radio off, the only sound the hum of the tires on the wet pavement. The sun was high enough now that the frost had melted from the fields, leaving behind a landscape that was brown and green and gray all at once. The colors of March in Maine. The colors of a world that had not decided what it wanted to be when it grew up. At the station, Nora sat at her desk and wrote out the entire chain of evidence, from the first call about the truck on the logging road to the grainy footage of a man with a limp renting a sedan with cash. She wrote it in chronological order, the way Ed had taught her years ago when she was still a teenager and he was still an old man who sometimes told stories about a past he never fully named. When she was finished, she read it back to herself. The logic was sound. The pieces fit. There was still a gap where the ankle monitor should have been, a hole in the story that needed to be filled. But she could feel the shape of the answer now, the way you could feel the shape of a key before you saw it, just by running your fingers over the lock. Her phone rang at noon. Beaumont. The monitoring company found something. He said, his voice was tight, the way voices got when the person speaking was trying very hard to stay calm. The device on Cole's ankle was tampered with. Not disabled, not removed, but the seal was broken and resealed. The company says it could have been taken off for up to 4 hours without triggering an alarm, as long as whoever put it back knew what they were doing. Nora closed her eyes. 4 hours is enough time to drive to Harrow Cove and back. Yes, Beaumont said. It is. She asked about the cigarette butt. Beaumont said the lab was still processing it. But he also said that a witness had come forward, a woman who lived on the road near the logging trail, who had seen a gray sedan parked on the shoulder around 11 on the night Peter Langley died. She had not thought anything of it at the time, but she had read about the death in the paper, and she had called the tip line that morning. She got a partial plate. Beaumont said, 3 letters. They matched the rental car. Nora did not say anything. She did not need to. "We are picking him up this afternoon," Beaumont said. "I wanted you to know before it happened." Nora thanked him and hung up. She sat at her desk for a long moment, the phone still in her hand, the dial tone humming in the quiet station. Through the window, she could see the street, the bare trees, the first car of the day making its way down Main Street at a careful speed. The driver, probably a local, who knew where the potholes were and how to avoid them. Cole came out of his office. He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Beaumont called me too. I know. He wants us to stay here. The state police will handle the arrest. Nora nodded. She had expected that. The arrest of David Cole would be a state matter, not a local one. He was still on bail for the earlier case. The new charges would be folded into the existing proceedings. Harrow Cove would be mentioned in the press releases, but only as the location of the crime, not as the department that solved it. That was fine with Nora. She did not need credit. She needed answers. The afternoon passed slowly. Nora answered 2 phone calls, both from residents asking about road closures that she did not have information about. She filed the duct tape report in the cabinet where the department kept closed cases, even though this one was not closed yet, not officially. She made coffee and did not drink it. She watched the clock on the wall and thought about David Cole sitting in his rented room in Rockland, waiting for the knock on the door. The knock came at 4:15. Nora was not there. She was at her desk in Harrow Cove, 40 miles away, staring at a page in her notebook that had nothing written on it except a single word. Why? She did not know why Peter Langley had lied 5 years ago. She did not know why David Cole had waited 5 years to act. She did not know whether the truth would make any of it better or whether some things were just broken and could not be fixed. Cole came to her desk at 5. He did not say anything at first. He just stood there, his hands in his pockets, his face softer than she had ever seen it. They picked him up without incident, he said. He did not fight. He did not say anything except that he wanted a lawyer. Nora looked up at him. Did he look guilty? Cole considered the question. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a long time for something to end. I do not know whether that is guilt or relief or something else entirely. He walked back to his office and closed the door. Nora sat alone at her desk, the fluorescent light flickering above her, the station empty except for the 2 of them and the dispatcher who had come on at 4 and was already half asleep at her post. She thought about Ed's question. What had David Cole learned in 5 years? The answer, she realized, was not what she had thought. He had not learned how to kill. He had not learned how to evade a GPS tracker or disable an ankle monitor or stage a suicide that looked real enough to fool the medical examiner. Those were just skills. Anybody could learn skills. What he had learned was how to wait. 5 years of waiting had taught him that patience was not passive. It was active. It was a choice you made every single day, sometimes every single hour, to hold yourself back from doing what you wanted to do because the time was not right. And when the time finally came, he had been ready. Nora closed her notebook and put on her coat. She walked out of the station into the cold March air. The sky above her, the pale blue of early evening, the first stars already visible in the east. The mud in the parking lot had begun to freeze again, the surface crusting over in thin sheets that cracked under her boots, like the sound of something breaking that could not be put back together. She drove home in the dark, the cruiser's headlights cutting through the night, the roads empty and quiet and still. David Cole was in custody. The case was over, at least for now. But she knew, with a certainty that sat somewhere in her chest and would not move, that she would think about him for a long time. A man who had spent 5 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. A man who had finally stopped waiting. She parked in her driveway and sat for a moment, the engine off, the interior cooling rapidly. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, then twice, then fell silent. She went inside and turned on the kitchen light. The house was cold. She did not bother to turn on the heat. She sat at the table and looked out the window at the dark and thought about justice and revenge and the thin line between them. She did not know where that line was anymore.
but she knew she had crossed it somehow, just by asking the questions that no one else had asked. And she knew she would cross it again. Chapter 10. The Thaw. The days that followed the arrest were quiet in Harrow Cove. The kind of quiet that settled over the town like a blanket, muffling sounds and slowing movements, and giving everyone a chance to breathe. The case was no longer a mystery. The newspapers had printed David Cole's name and photograph, alongside the words, "charged with murder," and "awaiting arraignment." The television crews had come and gone, setting up their cameras on the sidewalk outside the courthouse in Rockland, then packing them up when the story moved on to something else. Nora did not watch the coverage. She did not read the articles. She filed her reports and answered the phone and drank coffee that tasted like nothing, and she waited for the weight of the past week to lift from her shoulders. It did not lift, but it shifted. The way a heavy pack shifts when you adjust the straps, redistributing the load so that no single point bore all the pressure. On the fourth day after the arrest, she drove to Sarah Langley's house. It was not an official visit. Cole had not asked her to go. The case was closed, at least as far as the Harrow Cove Police Department was concerned, and any further communication with the family would be handled by the state police or the district attorney's office. But Nora had promised herself, somewhere in the middle of the long nights when she could not sleep, that she would not let the case end without looking Sarah Langley in the eye one more time. Sarah answered the door in the same jeans and sweater she had worn the first time Nora visited. Her hair was different, pulled back tighter, and her face was thinner, the bones more prominent, as if she had lost weight in the days since her husband died. But her eyes were clear. She was not crying. She looked, Nora thought, like someone who had been through something terrible and had decided, consciously and deliberately, to keep going. She invited Nora into the kitchen again. The same radiator ticked under the window. The same dishes sat in the drying rack, though these were different dishes, washed and stacked and waiting to be put away. The coffee was fresh. Sarah poured 2 cups without asking and set one in front of Nora. "I heard they arrested him," Sarah said. "David Cole." Nora nodded. "This morning, the state police released a statement. The evidence was sufficient to charge him with Peter's murder." Sarah wrapped her hands around her mug. She did not drink. She held the warmth and looked out the window at the field behind the house. The same field where the crows had been working something over on the day Nora first came. The field was empty now. The crows had moved on. "He thought Peter ruined his life," Sarah said. Her voice was flat, not angry, not sad, just stating a fact. "Maybe he was right. Maybe Peter did ruin his life. I do not know. I was not there 5 years ago. I did not see what Peter saw or did not see." Nora waited. "But I know Peter was not a bad man. He made mistakes. He lied sometimes, about small things, about money, about how he was feeling. But he was not a bad man." Sarah finally took a drink of her coffee. David Cole killed him because of something that happened 5 years ago. That is not justice. That is just more pain. Nora did not have an answer for that. She sat in the warm kitchen and listened to the radiator tick and watched the light change on the field as clouds moved across the sun. She thought about what Ed had said weeks ago, about the difference between justice and the best you could do. She thought about David Cole sitting in a jail cell, waiting for a trial that would determine the rest of his life. She thought about Peter Langley, dead in the cab of his own truck, a hose running from the exhaust pipe to the passenger window. "I am sorry," Nora said, "for your loss, for everything." Sarah looked at her. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Something that might have been gratitude, or might have been exhaustion, or might have been both. Then she nodded, and Nora stood up, and they walked to the door together. Out on the porch, the air was warmer than it had been. Not warm, exactly, but less cold. The kind of temperature that reminded you that spring was real and not just something people talked about in places where winter did not last so long. The snow was gone from the lawn. The brown grass was still brown, but there were patches of green near the foundation of the house, small and tentative, the first blades of the new season pushing up through the dead thatch of the old. Nora drove to Ed's house that evening. The sun was setting behind the pine trees, throwing long orange shadows across the yard, and the mud in the driveway had finally begun to dry in the tire tracks. She parked next to Ed's old truck and walked to the back door without knocking. The kitchen smelled of bread, not baking bread, but bread that had been baked earlier and was now cooling on the counter. A loaf the size of a small child, its crust dark and cracked and dusted with flour. Ed stood at the stove, stirring something in a pot, the same pot he had used for the fish chowder, the one that had been in the family longer than Nora had been alive. "Sit down," he said, without turning around. "Dinner will be ready in 10 minutes. Nora sat. Biscuit was on the couch, his head on his paws, his eyes half closed. He thumped his tail once when she walked in, then went back to whatever he had been doing before she arrived, which appeared to be nothing at all. Ed brought 2 bowls to the table. This time it was beef stew, the meat so tender it fell apart on the spoon. The carrots cooked down until they were almost sweet, the broth thick and dark and rich. He set a plate of bread in the middle of the table, the loaf cut into thick slices, the butter soft in a small dish beside it. They ate in silence for a while. The clock ticked on the wall. The radiator hissed. Biscuit snored softly, a wet rumble that vibrated through the couch and across the floor. Ed set down his spoon. "How are you doing?" Nora considered the question. It was not the kind of question people usually asked her, not really. They asked how the case was going, how work was, whether she had heard from Jamie. They did not ask how she was doing, as if the two things were separate, as if the case and the work and the worry about her brother were not all happening inside the same body at the same time, every day. "I do not know," she said. "I am not sure David Cole deserved what happened to him. 5 years in prison for something he might not have done? That is a long time. That is a long time to sit in a cell and think about the person who put you there." Ed nodded. He picked up his spoon, then set it down again. And Peter Langley. Peter Langley did not deserve to die the way he did. In the cab of his own truck, with a hose in the window, alone in the dark. Nora looked at her bowl. The stew had gone still. A thin film of fat was forming on the surface. "I do not know how to hold both of those things at the same time. That Cole was wronged, and that Cole was wrong. That Peter was a liar, and that Peter was a victim." Ed was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Sometimes justice is not the best thing we can do. Sometimes it is just the only thing we have." Nora looked up at him. His face was the same as it always was, calm and lined and older than she wanted to admit. But there was something in his eyes that she had not seen before. Or maybe she had seen it and had not understood it. A weariness, a recognition. The look of a man who had spent his life asking questions and had learned that the answers did not always make things better. "You have seen this before," she said. It was not a question. Ed did not answer. He picked up his spoon and ate the last of his stew, slowly, deliberately, the way he did everything. Then he set the spoon down and folded his hands on the table. "I have seen versions of it," he said. "Different names, different places, but the shape is always the same. Someone hurts someone. The someone who was hurt someone else. And the person who was hurt by that hurt someone else again. It is a chain, Nora. It does not break on its own." Nora thought about David Cole. She thought about Peter Langley.
She thought about the trial 5 years ago and the testimony that had sent an innocent man to prison, and the years of waiting that had turned a victim into a killer. "How does it break?" she asked. Ed looked at her. "Someone has to decide that the hurting stops with them, that they will not pass it on, that they will take the pain and absorb it and let it die inside them instead of handing it to someone else." He paused. "That is the hardest thing a person can do. Harder than revenge, harder than justice, harder than anything." Outside, the light had faded completely. The kitchen was bright and warm, the windows dark. The only reflection, Nora's own face, staring back at her from the glass. She sat with Ed's words for a long time, turning them over in her mind, testing them against everything she knew about David Cole and Peter Langley and the world they had both destroyed. Biscuit woke up. He stretched, his front paws sliding forward on the couch cushion, his back arched in a deep curve. Then he jumped down and walked to Nora's chair and put his head on her knee. She scratched behind his ears, the way she had done since she was a teenager, the way she would do until the dog was too old to care. Ed stood up and carried the bowls to the sink. He ran water over them and left them in the basin to soak. The same thing he did every night, the same thing he would do tomorrow night and the night after that. Some things did not change. Some things were not supposed to change. Nora put on her coat and her boots and walked to the door. The night air was cold but not bitter, the kind of cold that warned you that winter was still there, but also promised that it would not last forever. The sky was clear, the stars bright, the moon a thin crescent hanging low over the harbor. She drove home through the dark streets of Harrow Cove. The town was quiet, the houses dark, the only light coming from the occasional porch lamp and the blue glow of televisions in living rooms where people had already settled in for the night. The roads were drier than they had been a week ago. The mud was hardening. The thaw was coming, slowly and unevenly, but it was coming. She parked in her driveway and sat for a moment with the engine off. The night was quiet. The stars were bright. Somewhere to the south, beyond the trees and the water and the miles of dark road between her and Rockland, David Cole was sitting in a cell, waiting for whatever came next. She did not know whether he deserved what he had gotten. She did not know whether Peter Langley deserved what he had gotten either. She only knew that she had done her job. She had asked the questions. She had followed the evidence. She had found the truth, or as much of the truth as anyone would ever know. She got out of the car and walked to the front door. The porch light was on, left over from the night before, the bulb warm to the touch. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was cold and dark and empty. She did not turn on the lights. She walked to the couch and sat down in the dark, the way she had done so many nights before, the way she would do again. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, then twice, then fell silent. Jamie was coming home. Maybe a month, maybe 2. She held on to that thought the way you held on to a handrail in the dark, not because you could not walk without it, but because it reminded you that you were not alone. The night stretched out in front of her, long and quiet, and full of the small sounds of a house settling after winter. She lay down on the couch and pulled the blanket over her legs and closed her eyes. She did not sleep, but she rested, and that, for now, was enough.